Okay, well, welcome everyone to the first of our SNARL spring series seminars. This is the COVID edition, so we're doing all these remotely this spring. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Carol Blanchette, and I'm the director here at the Valentine Eastern Sierra Reserves. We are all enjoying a lovely late season snowy day here in Mammoth. So in keeping with the theme of today's talk, and as many of you know, here at the Valentine Reserves, we have a large and active outdoor science education program. And we are really pleased to announce that we will be able to return to running several of our popular outdoor science education programs for kids this summer. And in the long history of our program, and particularly in the context of today's talk, never before has the word outdoor been more important. All of our programs will be entirely outdoors, COVID safe. And as you all know, we've long been fans of teaching and learning in the outdoors. So registration for those programs opens on next Monday, May 3rd, and more details are available at our website, and I'll show you that in just a minute. I also wanted to say that we have this spring a really great lineup of speakers for the next month. So every Tuesday at 7 p.m. from now until June 8th, you can grab your favorite beverage and join us from your couch for the next 6 weeks for some really great remote adventures. And I will just share my screen for a minute here so I can show you where to find all of this information. So if you're interested in our outdoor science education programs, you go to our website, which is vser.nrs.ucsb.edu, click on Education and Outreach. You can click on the Outdoor Science Education Program, and then the link for the summer classes. And here you'll see all of our classes. You can download a registration form PDF in English or Spanish. And you, from Monday on, you can register for each of the classes by hitting the orange button for register. And you'll notice that in keeping with the last several years, we have, once again, 2 dual language classes, so Spanish and English. These are all week-long classes, and the grade levels that they're geared towards are listed in the descriptions. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to us. I also wanted to show you that if you click on the seminar series tab, you can also find direct links for all of the seminars for each week. So you can just go there and click those orange buttons. We tried to make it as easy as possible for everyone. Okay. So now it looks like we've got a bunch of folks on. I'd like to say first that our opening seminar in the season is always one that we think is really exciting and important and timely. And tonight's seminar is all of these. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Craig Strang. Dr. Craig Strang is truly one of the experts in the field of science education. Not only is he one of the leaders in this field, he is a completely nice and non-arrogant person, which is a rare combination in our world of science sometimes. He is the Associate Director for the Lawrence Hall of Science, and if you haven't been there, I highly recommend that place, especially if you're a science nerd like myself. And hopefully when things are opened up, you'll be able to visit there again. So I first became familiar with Craig and his work in the area of ocean science education when I was an ocean science researcher at UC Santa Barbara. He also began his career as a marine biologist, and his passion for both the oceans and education led him to develop the ocean literacy principles that lie at the heart of what everyone should actually know about the oceans. He is also co-chair of the California Environmental Literacy Task Force, which is leading the effort to improve environmental literacy for all Californians. He's been at the forefront of science education and is the director of BaySci, which is a program that improves the capacity of school districts to support high quality science education. He's also a PI in a program called Beetles, which focuses in particular on environmental and outdoor education. So I first got to know Craig about 10 years ago when I became more involved in science education as part of a research project aimed at understanding how students learn concepts in environmental science and how best to address those learning gaps for key concepts related to carbon, water, and biodiversity. About this same time, 10 years ago, education researchers, including Craig, were working through the development of a new framework for science education called the Next Generation Science Standards. These standards, thankfully, were finally adopted in California and in many other states in 2013. And they are quite literally, I would say, a revolution in the way science is taught nowadays. So today, Craig is going to focus on the idea of teaching and learning outdoors. And as many of us know, there's a huge body of research demonstrating the effectiveness and gains from outdoor learning and environment-based education. So outdoor learning is a great idea in non-pandemic times. So could this be an even better idea during a pandemic? As we all know, COVID has created huge challenges for education. Unfortunately, the solution in many places has been to bring the largest population of unvaccinated people in this country, those people under the age of 16, to the same indoor environments we've all been avoiding for the last year. So given that we already know that outdoor learning is engaging and effective, and it's much safer for unvaccinated people to be outdoors, could this be a win-win? So to provide some insights and tell us what he thinks, I'm going to turn it over to Craig.
Thanks so much, Carol. Can I just say yes, and then I'm done? I think you're right. Win-win. But thank you so much for inviting me to come tonight, and thank you all for joining the first SNARL webinar. I want to begin tonight by acknowledging that I live and work typically in Berkeley, California, on the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone people, who still live on that land and care for it. It turns out that I'm actually not there at the moment. I'm coming to you from Sweden, but I still wanted to acknowledge the land and the people in my home and the home of the Chochenyo Ohlone people. I also want to establish, before I start, my UC Reserve System street cred. I'm a UC Santa Cruz graduate, and I spent a lot of my undergraduate years hanging out with Ken Norris, the founder of the UC Natural Reserve System, and visited many of them during the natural history field quarter that he led for many years. And so I have a particular fondness for the reserve system and really appreciate the work, deeply appreciate the work that Carol and all the others in the system do to protect these really, really amazing lands. So now you've heard a little bit about me. We wanted to find out a little bit about you before I launch into my slides. I think Carol's gonna put up a quick poll, a one question multiple choice poll, and you can check the box that best describes you and then hit submit, and we'll all get to see a little bit about who's in the group tonight. I think when the poll ends, we should see results. There we go. Okay, so you can all see there, K-5 educators, a couple of secondary educators, some research scientists, and several community members, a few informal science educators. So pretty diverse group, and pretty evenly distributed across those categories. So that's fascinating. And hopefully you'll all find something of value from thinking together across disciplines about this seemingly simple but kind of challenging topic of doing the obvious right thing and getting kids outdoors during and after this pandemic that we're in. So thanks for the poll. I'm going to share my screen now. And start in. I want to talk a little bit this evening about this idea of utilizing outdoor spaces in very particular and strategic ways to facilitate the reopening of schools, and then beyond that to set a precedent for using outdoor spaces to kind of reinvent and rethink and reimagine the way that schooling takes place in California and potentially nationwide. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing in the National COVID-19 Outdoor Learning Initiative. This is an initiative that grew up literally overnight last summer in the midst of the pandemic, and was founded by these four organizations: Green Schoolyards America, Lawrence Hall of Science, San Mateo County Office of Education, and 10 Strands. So before I talk about the initiative itself, I want to do a little bit of context setting and probably tell you things that you already know, that you've been reading about in the paper, and if you're a parent, you've been experiencing firsthand. And that is the impact that remote learning has had on our school system and on the students that are in our school system, and the very particular inequitable impact that it's had on communities of color. Here's where we were last spring after schools closed just for the months of March, April, and May at the end of the school year. And you can see in the graph on the left that schools that had greater numbers of low-income students had much higher absentee rates. So for instance, on that bottom bar, schools that had 75% or more students from low-income families, in those schools, about a third of the kids never logged in during that 3-month period, were essentially absent or, quote, truant from school for the entire end of the school year. The graphs on the right provide at least a partial explanation of what was going on during that period. Those same schools that had over 75% low-income students also offered the fewest opportunities for live classes. So the poorer you are, the less likely you were to have live instruction. So in those schools with 75% or more low-income kids, only 14% of those kids were offered any live instruction during that period. No surprise that they ended up not showing up for school very often. That was last spring. Early this fall, in September, the Alliance for Excellent Education did a study of California and determined that out of the 6.3 million K-12 students in the state, there are 1.8 million students that do not have access to high-speed internet, including about a quarter of all Black students and a third of all Latinx, Native American students. And that there are 690,000 students that have no access to a device, so that even if they had high-speed internet, they wouldn't have a device to log on with. Now, once these data became available, the state of California did make some significant efforts to change these circumstances and increased access to high-speed internet and distributed devices. But even with that effort, the impact on low income and students of color was hugely disproportionate. And you can see a little bit of that here. This is now 3 months further on in December. This is looking at elementary school students. And for instance, in that top row, the average student in reading, the average white student learned about 90% of what they would have learned in an average year during school year 2019-20. That's white students learned about 90% of what they would have in an average year. Students of color, on the other hand, learned 77% in reading of what they would have in an average year. And the statistics are worse in math than they were in reading. And you can see that for kindergarten through 5th grade. And interestingly, the older students got, the less learning took place during this period of remote learning, so that 5th graders who were white learned 53% of what they would have in an average year in math, and students of color only 37%. And this is for school year 2019-20. So again, it was reflecting only that spring that schools were shut. So you can imagine what these data might look like for this current school year when schools have been closed almost continuously from September through now. But you can see this pretty significant disproportionate impact on students of color. And again, in partial explanation for that poor performance among students of color, you can see here that Black and Hispanic students have a 20% greater chance of being entirely in remote learning compared to white students. So we're seeing that, that at least for the entire fall, these data go September through December, the impact on Black and Hispanic students having no live instruction or no face-to-face instruction, no hybrid or in-person instruction was significant. And then the last little bit of data that I'll show you here is a study that was just published today by the National Academy of Sciences, a study that took place in Netherlands, which is considered the best case scenario for an education system responding to the pandemic. Best case scenario because in the Netherlands, they have a completely equitable school funding model. That is, every school gets exactly the same amount of money, not at all like California, where funding is based on zip code. And the Netherlands has the highest rate of broadband access anywhere in the world. They conducted their regular twice-a-year assessments to 350,000 students ages 8 through 11 before and after the pandemic shutdown, and compared those data to the 3 previous years. And what they found is that the percentile losses of learning were 60% larger among students from disadvantaged homes. And that's in the best case scenario, hardly comparable to California or the United States. And so you can imagine that the learning loss differential is even greater between white students and students of color here in the United States. And what about science in particular? What do we know? Not very much. There's not a lot of data about what happened in science instruction so far during the pandemic, but we know that in pre-COVID elementary schools in California, the average elementary school student in our state received 60 minutes or less of science per week. throughout the state, kindergarten through 5th grade, 60 minutes or less. And 4th and 5th graders typically get about 75 minutes or so. And so if you're in kindergarten through 3rd grade, you're probably getting 20 to 30 minutes of science per week. That's pre-COVID. And in the one survey that I could find that took place after the pandemic began, 88% of teachers in California say their students are learning less science during the pandemic than they were before. My personal experience working with many school districts, 15 school districts around the state during the pandemic, is that most of them gave up teaching science once they went to online remote learning. Okay, so that's kind of what's been going on in our school system since March of 2020. At that same time, there's been equally devastating challenge in our outdoor learning community that has also resulted in an equity disaster. Last May, Lawrence Hall of Science conducted a survey of outdoor science and environmental education organizations nationwide. We received responses from about 1,000 organizations around the country. About 235 of them were from California. So I'll just share the California results with you tonight. The 230 organizations in California told us that if they stayed closed from May of 2020 until December of 2020, that they estimated that 4 million students would be missing outdoor learning opportunities, and that nearly 60% of those came from low-income communities and communities of color. Of course, all those organizations did in fact stay shut until December of 2020, and most of them are still shut now. So even more kids have missed those opportunities. Those same organizations laid off or furloughed over 5,000 outdoor educators. Now, this is an important statistic and an important concept, that there is now in California an available workforce of trained up, skilled, enthusiastic, generous educators dying to work with kids in the outdoors, who are most comfortable working with kids in the outdoors, and they're not being able to ply their trade at the moment. The most disconcerting information that we learned in the survey in May of 2020 was that only 27% of the organizations in the state that provide outdoor learning opportunities reported that they were certain or very likely to reopen ever. So nearly 3/4 of the organizations in the state that provide these rich learning experiences are at risk of shutting down and never reopening. So that's what we learned as of May of 2020. We're in the process of conducting a follow-up study to the policy brief that we called A Field at Risk. We are currently collecting data right now as we speak. We're going to close down the data collection in a couple of weeks, and we hope to have a new policy brief published in June of this year. I really don't know what we're going to find out and what we're going to hear from organization leaders around the country and within California, but I'll kind of tell you what I'm anticipating. I'm anticipating that there will be fewer permanent closures than were originally projected. I think a lot of organizations were able to somehow manage to stay alive, and they will not permanently close, although many, and especially the smaller organizations, have closed. But that there's going to be a huge contraction of the footprint, the services provided, the number of students served through these programs. In organizations that I'm in contact with, we're hearing that they're staying open, but that they've reduced their staff from 30 to 3. from 50 to 4, and that they're surviving primarily by delivering small scale online virtual programs, virtual field trips to schools, and maybe some to the public. So I'm kind of off the record anticipating huge contraction and fewer permanent closures than were originally projected, and that these organizations that are barely staying alive are facing a very uncertain relationship to our school system and not knowing what kind of organization they need to be when they start to reopen and rehire staff. Most of them have been delivering some kind of virtual programming, and they're not sure in the future if there is a future in outdoor learning taking place outdoors. And they're wondering, are we going to be able to work with kids outdoors again? Or are we going to be on Zoom permanently? And this is because as schools are facing the crisis that they're in, there is a sentiment, I think, that outdoor learning and field trips are peripheral, not central, far from the core, and far from the desperate priorities that they have for reopening. Now, Carol, and probably everybody here in this room, thinks just the opposite, that that outdoor learning and field trips and being outdoors should be central to reopening plans, but not all schools are seeing it that way quite yet. And here's the evidence behind what Carol proposed in her opening comments. There are many myriad benefits to outdoor learning, both health benefits and learning benefits. COVID transmission is 20 times lower outdoors. There's no surfaces to wipe. Kids are safer, healthier, more engaged, and oh, by the way, they learn more outdoors than they do indoors. There's a great set of studies that demonstrate that when kids are outdoors, they're calmer, more focused, more able to stay on task, and have fewer behavior problems than when they're indoors. And not only that, but when those same kids that were outdoors for an hour come back into the classroom, the effect is retained for at least an hour back in the classroom. That is, that when kids go back into the class, they remain more focused, calmer, more on task, more task-oriented, fewer behavior problems. And that just the act of being outdoors lowers anxiety, improves social and emotional learning, and fosters this incredible effect of connection to nature. Nicole Ardwan and Allison Bowers at Stanford, colleagues of mine, published this great brief in December that provides a survey and a summary of research and describes decades of studies that show that exposure to nature is vital to physical and psychological well-being and intellectual and social development, and that these effects are particularly important for young children whose development are even more greatly influenced by stimulus that comes from nature and natural phenomena. So there's no argument in the research about this. These are very clear findings that have been shown over and over and over again. And yet we find that school systems resist the idea of being outdoors and have this kind of unshakable notion that that's time off or time away from learning. And at the same time that there are these benefits of being outdoors, we've experienced shelter in place, all the fires, and the closing of state and national parks that all have disproportionately prevented access to being outdoors by communities of color. And if you remember last spring, when the good weather hit and the state parks were flooded and overrun by visitors like no time in our history, the parks shut down, and the state health department and county health departments were telling us that we should not drive to a state park, but rather we should be spending time outdoors only in places that were within walking distance of our homes. And these health guidelines had a very particular and, again, disproportionate impact on communities of color who often live in neighborhoods that have been systematically and intentionally designed not to have city parks, community parks, and open, safe outdoor spaces. In this paper that Nicole Ardwan wrote, she proposed 3 solutions-oriented concepts at the end of the paper, and they're pertinent to the work that we've been doing. The first one is that school systems should emphasize and pursue restorative experiences in nature, that this is a really important time, an essential time for kids to have more, not less, exposure to nature, both for learning, but for the healing properties that it can provide for kids that have been through some trauma during the pandemic. The second concept is that the school system, K through 12 school system, should leverage the expertise that's available from the environmental educator workforce that is now largely unemployed or furloughed, but is available to support the needs of families for both schooling and for connection to nature. And then the third concept is that beyond helping us through this immediate crisis of reopening schools and overcoming the trauma of the pandemic, that school systems should harness the creativity and expertise of environmental educators to re-envision 21st century learning so that all of our school systems provide regular and routine outdoor learning opportunities for kids forever. So the work of the National COVID-19 Outdoor Learning Initiative has focused on helping school systems to create partnerships with outdoor learning organizations and to really take advantage of the expertise that resides in the outdoor learning organizations that desperately need a reason to exist in the current climate where they've had their staff so greatly reduced. And we think that these partnerships can take advantage of the trained up available workforce for all phases of school reopening. And there are 3 phases that we've kind of described. The first one, when schools are in 100% remote learning and kids are at home learning online, school systems can create on-site, in-person bubbles of students, the most vulnerable students that have the most difficulty learning in an online context, and that outdoor educators can provide support in outdoor spaces for both remote learning and for providing outdoor science and environmental education experiences. And then as schools start to reopen with staggered schedules and hybrid learning, we have this idea that the staggered schedule should be classroom experiences staggered with outdoor learning experiences, not classroom experiences staggered with remote experiences, and that hybrid learning should be face-to-face classroom experiences hybridized with face-to-face outdoor learning experiences, not online, and that outdoor educators can be employed working within our school systems to provide those staggered and hybrid experiences. And then once schools are back on site 100% of the time, hopefully next fall, we're imagining this reinventing of 21st century learning experiences that would have a more permanent impact on our state, and that is incorporating outdoor learning as a regular routine part of the curriculum in the school day in every school. So that's kind of the theoretical idea. That's kind of our ambitious concept, and it's a lot to make happen in practical terms. And that's where the National COVID-19 Outdoor Learning Initiative comes in. We formed last spring, really focused around the equity disaster and trying to ensure that the most vulnerable students are the first to be able to have access to outdoor learning opportunities. The Outdoor Learning Initiative attracted several hundred volunteers early last summer, and we organized these several hundred volunteers into 11 working groups. Each working group developed a whole series of resources and tools and publications and guidance documents to help schools work through the logistics and the planning for accommodating outdoor learning. And you can see the 11 different working groups that included everything from where to buy picnic tables and outdoor furniture and individual outdoor desks and awnings and tent structures, all the way up through learning and instructional models, curriculum materials, what kinds of professional development are needed, and how to establish partnerships with community-based organizations that have expertise in environmental and outdoor learning. All of these resources are available on the COVID-19 Outdoor Learning Initiative website, and everything is free and downloadable. And there are literally thousands of pages of guidance documents available to schools. So the initiative is really trying to help school systems to connect to all those resources that are now available on the website, help school districts that are not huge on capacity and bandwidth at the moment to address all the logistical issues that need to be put in place. And we're in particular trying to arrange these partnerships to identify community-based organizations nearby to school districts that can help with outdoor learning. And we're identifying funding from foundations and state funds to support outdoor learning. This is just a list of a sampling of some of the resources that are available on the website of the National COVID-19 Outdoor Learning Initiative. And you can see their materials from the Beatles project that are designed specifically for outdoor science programs, curriculum materials and professional learning materials. And then we've developed a whole new set of materials that are outdoor science resources for schools to use that are really customized to the needs of school systems. And we're advocating that schools think about both learning outdoors and outdoor learning. And what I mean by that is that teachers can take their math worksheets and sit outside under a tree and do them. Teachers can teach reading and have kids writing in journals and notebooks outdoors, just doing what they would have been doing indoors, but taking them outdoors to do it, as well as engaging in authentic outdoor learning that really takes advantage of natural phenomenon as part of the science and environmental education curriculum. I would encourage you to read some of these amazing stories and vignettes and case studies that we have of school systems that are really on the leading edge of outdoor learning, that have really seen the pandemic as an opportunity to take advantage of outdoor learning. And these are just 6 here that I've listed, but there are many examples in California and around the country of schools doing extraordinary things. In Portland, Maine in particular, every teacher is teaching 100% outdoors, and that was including over the winter time out in the snow. And every school in Portland, Maine had 3 or more outdoor classrooms that were built by parents over last summer in preparation for opening schools in September. And they've been back in school 100% with kids outdoors the entire school year. The last thing that I want to share with you, I think it's the last thing, is a quote, and it's kind of long, and I'm going to read it to you on the next slide, but I'll tell you the context first. There was a webinar last summer that was put on by UC San Francisco Medical School. And the webinar was for teachers and school administrators focused on health considerations related to reopening during the COVID-19 pandemic. And they were talking about air filtration systems and how far apart desks had to be, and plexiglass shields and all that stuff, and all the masking and face shields, et cetera. And I was one of, I don't know, 650 people that were listening to the webinar. And at the end, there was an opportunity to ask questions just by typing questions into the question box, a little bit like you'll have the opportunity to do in a minute. And I just was one of several hundred people who asked a question, and I typed in, what role do you think outdoor learning should play in schools' reopening plans? And the keynote speaker, Dr. Soheil Sood, who's a pediatrician and works at UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital, said, completely unscripted, off the top of his head, this. He said, "We have a question about outdoor learning. What role should it play in schools' reopening plans? Be outside. Just do it. There's so many benefits to being outside, decreased number of high-touch surfaces. It's often easier to physically distance ourselves. There's essentially no recirculated air. Just properties of dilution in a big outdoor space have so much benefit. And there's even some degree of germ fighting power. They've done studies using simulated light, because it's hard to do these experiments outside, in which they found that simulated sunlight inactivated the flu virus 90% faster than darkness did. And being outside also provides just innumerable general benefits to physical and mental health. So I think outdoors is the place to be. And if you'd told me in 2019 that we'd be conducting healthcare in an outdoor setting in a tent, I would have said, no way. Our vials are going to go flying around. Our papers are going to get everywhere. And we're not going to have access to all our electronic equipment. It's never going to happen. And yet, here we are doing outdoor medicine throughout the country to a fairly reasonable, fairly well. Teachers are far more flexible, far more innovative, far smarter than doctors. So I think they can find a way to make it happen. It's happened before. It happened in the 1900s. We used this technique to combat tuberculosis. You can Google pictures of kids in wool uniforms on rooftops in floor-to-ceiling, open-windowed classrooms. And it's happening now in Europe. A lot of places are doing school outside. So there you go. Like, amazing, right? What a great vision. And I'm hoping that this message gets out to schools. As I've said, there's been some uptake, and there are many school systems, not the majority by any means, but there are many school systems who are really doing extraordinary things and creating outdoor classrooms and bringing kids back in the outdoors and overcoming the equity challenges that were presented by the pandemic. The California Department of Education has invited us to do a webinar tomorrow afternoon that's sponsored by the California Department of Education. Tony Thurman, the Superintendent of Public Instruction, is going to be on that webinar and will introduce us and make a plug for outdoor learning. So I think that it is possible, and there are some really good things happening. And I'm hoping that this is going to really generate some momentum. And there's also relief funding available. There's about $4.6 billion that have been released from the California General Fund for school systems to overcome, quote, learning loss that resulted from the pandemic. And those funds can be used for infrastructure, for building outdoor classrooms, and for contracting with community-based partners that are expert in outdoor and environmental education to provide expanded learning and extended learning opportunities to kids. So I think that we're not in a great position right now, but there's some clearly hopeful signals that this concept could really become a reality in the next few months. So with that, I'm going to stop. And I think there's an opportunity for people to ask questions. Is that right, Carol?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. And I think just to let everyone out there know that if you have a question, you can just hit that Q&A button on the bottom of your screen and type it in, or you can raise your hand. We have a small enough group here that I think I can select your name if you'd like to talk and ask your question in person. But first I want to just say that Craig, it sounds like the answer to the question is it's not just a win-win, it's like a win-win, win-win-win.
Right, right. And it's one of those, you know, when we're doing, like, when we started the National COVID-19 Outdoor Learning Initiative, and when we're getting the results in from the Field at Risk study, there was a lot of media attention, and I probably did 30 or 40 interviews, radio, TV, newspapers, national, local, state, etc. And nearly every reporter asked me sometime during the interview, you know, Craig, this sounds like it makes so much sense. Why isn't it happening? Like, this is so obvious. Why aren't we doing it? And I kind of was like, it's not, you know, it's really a problem of our imagination. It's not that it's difficult to figure out or logistically impossible or too expensive. It's just a matter of vision and imagination.
And maybe lack of just the inertia that needs to happen as we move forward. So I will just read out the questions to you, Craig, that are typed into our Q&A. And then again, if anyone has anything they want to add, I recognize a lot of names on our list of participants here are teachers. So really excited to hear from you guys. Kevin asks, are there any educational loss studies comparable to the Dutch and California studies from other countries that had better response to COVID-19, particularly Asian countries? Similarly, are there other countries that used significant outdoor learning?
Well, that's a lot of questions. So there are several countries, Scotland in particular, that went to outdoor learning very quickly in the pandemic and had great success and had schools closed for much shorter periods of time. I don't know about learning outcomes. Was that one of the questions about better learning and academic outcomes?
Yeah, educational loss studies comparable to the Dutch and California studies from other countries that had a better response to COVID-19.
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I shared everything I got. I don't know of other studies that have been done in other countries, and I think that a lot of that research is not yet been published. We're probably going to be finding out a lot more in the next several months. And maybe others know of studies in Asia or in other places, but you know, in Taiwan, schools were shut down for a much shorter period of time. And I think in general, countries that had stricter health precautions, that masked earlier, for instance, and were more cautious with social distancing and public events, had schools closed down for much shorter periods of time. So Taiwan schools were only shut down for several weeks, I think, and then they were reopened with kids and teachers in masks.
Cool. We've got another question from Debbie Boucher, one of our teachers here in Mammoth. And she says, at one point there was a forest school group in Mammoth Lakes. And does anyone know about this? And I think she's referring to the forest school was a sort of outdoor education school that was based here in Mammoth Lakes. And I don't know if anyone has any information on that out there. You can respond to that, but I think maybe the larger question there too might be, could there be new opportunities for schools like this to sort of emerge beyond the pandemic? I mean, it sort of sounded like from the data you presented, it was a fairly gloomy picture right now for many of these organizations doing environmental science and outdoor learning. If we are able to sort of retool our educational systems to invite these folks in, could there be new opportunities, do you think, in the future?
Yeah, I think in particular, there's an opportunity for outdoor learning organizations that typically brought students to their site to do more work back at school sites and in local communities, not to the exclusion of bringing kids to your fabulous sites. But I think that schools are going to be looking for outdoor learning close to school, in addition to the occasional field trips and hopefully residential outdoor schools. And so I think that's an opportunity for outdoor learning to take place on schoolyards, in neighborhoods, in school gardens, in local parks within walking distance of schools, et cetera. And that if those experiences could be connected to more traditional field trips, I think schools are going to be very open to those kind of partnerships, and that connect learning from classroom to outdoor close by to outdoor in natural areas. So I think that's a potential growth area.
Nice. We have another question here, and this is a great one. So this is from Sarah Kingston, and I will preface this question with saying that she writes, we are the California Ecology and Conservation course instructors and students that are here right now at SNARL. So right here now at SNARL, we're hosting a group of about 30 students, and I can see them out my window right now. And they are here at SNARL. This is the first undergraduate class we've had here since before COVID began. So in over a year, and they've gone through extremely sort of detailed precautions of quarantine and isolation and testing in order to be able to form a pod and be here. And so they're all signed in and listening to this right now over there as a class in the classroom. And they're asking, our students are wondering how you got into outdoor education, or what was your first outdoor education experience?
Oh, well, thanks for asking, and awesome that you're all there doing good stuff. So I love that. I actually grew up in California, and my school sent us to 5th grade camp, which was a residential outdoor learning experience, and 6th grade camp. So I had a week of outdoor ed in both 5th and 6th grade. And then when I got into high school, I came back to the 6th grade camp as a cabin counselor, and did that a couple of times, and got to be friends with one of the naturalists that worked in the program. And he told me, hey, you'd probably be good at this. Why don't you come back after you get out of high school and work as a naturalist for a few weeks. And so I was a freshman at UC Santa Cruz, and he convinced me to take a couple of weeks off of school out of my college classes and go work as a naturalist for 2 weeks in the outdoor ed program. And I was like, wow, this is pretty awesome. And so I started off my career before I knew that outdoor education was a thing, that was even a career path. That was the first thing that I ever really did in education. And I've kind of circled around it and come back to it many times over the course of my career. But I think really I'm one of those people who had a profound formative experience in elementary school that put me on a path that I wouldn't have predicted otherwise.
Nice. So with one more, let me just follow up that with a couple more questions from that class in particular. So they ask, with the California new standards of education, do you see outdoor learning being more integral past COVID, number one? And then number two, what are the best courses of action that the government, state or local, can take to promote outdoor learning, especially in schools with lower income communities?
Well, so the first part, the California science standards, called Next Generation Science Standards, have a very strong focus first on the content side in environmental science, ocean science, climate science, environmental science. So those kinds of concepts are all through the standards from kindergarten through 12th grade, and increasingly on climate change and climate education in secondary grades 6 through 12. Beyond that, there's a huge focus on learning science by way of experiencing natural phenomenon. And so when you're in conversations in California and many states now about science education, you'll always hear phenomena come up. What are the phenomena? What are the phenomena? How, what practices are we going to use to engage students in phenomena? And of course, there are some phenomena that you can experience in a classroom and that you can watch on a screen. And there's a lot more, and they're a lot richer when you go outside. So I think that there's kind of a natural tendency for science educators in California and any state that's using NGSS to be taking kids outdoors and experiencing phenomena. From a government perspective, well, depends on whether we have a functional government or not. But I think that one specific, very concrete thing that can be done, for instance, that was done in Oregon, is the Oregon state government has funded Outdoor School for All, a week of residential outdoor learning for every kid in Oregon sometime between grades 4 and 8. And that foundational experience that can oftentimes be transformative for the students also has a tendency to shape the curriculum of teachers for several grades on either side of it. So if you know that kids are going to be going to outdoor school for a week in 5th grade, the 2nd grade teachers, the 3rd grade teachers, the 4th grade teachers are naturally going to be building up experiences so that kids are ready for that week in 5th grade. And then middle school teachers in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade know that their kids have had that foundational experience, and they're more likely to build on it and have additional field experiences in their curriculum as well. So I think being strategic about finding leverage points in the system and then making those leverage points available explicitly to students from the most vulnerable communities first is a way to both promote outdoor learning and work toward our equity goals. the funding, I think that's the key, is that that the funding should be applied to the most vulnerable students first.
And I'm glad, Craig, that you brought up that example of Oregon. And I was thinking about that as well. And I would just be curious to know, from your opinion, how likely something like that is to fly in California.
Well, the real answer is not very likely, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to go for it. Last week, we had a phone call in the California Environmental Literacy Initiative and the COVID-19 Outdoor Learning Initiative folks. We had a phone call with the consulting group that got that ballot initiative passed in Oregon. And now they're working in Washington, and they expect that it could be passed in Washington in the next year. And we're trying to figure out, like, what would it take in a state that's 86 kabillion times bigger than Oregon. But we're gonna take a crack at it and see if we can get some traction.
Awesome. And I just have to say, I'll in the interest of time, I will just comment on one more question that's here. It's not really so much as a question, but this is from Kathy Copeland. She runs a program here in the Eastern Sierra called Disabled Sports, Eastern Sierra. And so they work a lot with people with disabilities, including servicemen and women with special needs. And she just wants to echo the sentiment that she feels this is all so very important and relevant to them as well. Getting those people outdoors as much as possible, and they're building back their teams as well. I mean, it's definitely its own unique segment of outdoor education for sure. So, I think that's just something for us all to keep in mind, and people in all kinds of areas like that doing great work. So, Craig, I just want to thank you so much. And it's been beautiful watching the sunrise behind you there in Sweden. I had to Google what time it is in Sweden, and it's almost 5 in the morning. So you've been up early, and we so appreciate you joining us and sharing your knowledge with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. Good night or good morning.